Chapter 17. The Square. Momo was too scared to go back to the amphitheater. She felt sure the man in gray would turn up there for their midnight meeting, and the thought of being all alone with him in the deserted ruins filled her with terror. No, she never wished to see him again, neither there nor anywhere else. Whatever his proposition might be, it boded no good for her and her friends. That was as plain as a pikestaff. But where could she hide from him? A crowded place seemed the best bet. Although no one had taken any notice before, if the man in gray really tried to harm her and she called for help, people would surely hear and come to her aid. Besides, she told herself, she'd be harder to find in a crowd than on her own. So Momo spent the rest of the afternoon walking the busiest streets and squares, surrounded by jostling pedestrians. All through the evening and well into the night she continued to trudge in a big circle that brought her back to her starting point. Around and around she went, swept along by a fast-flowing tide of humanity, until she had completed no fewer than 3 of these circuits. After keeping this up for so many hours, her weary feet began to ache. It grew later and later, but still she walked half asleep, and on and on and on. Just a little rest, she told herself at last. Just a teeny little rest. Then I'll be more on my guard. Parked beside the curb was a little 3-wheeled delivery truck laden with an assortment of sacks and cartons. Momo climbed aboard, found herself a nice, soft sack, and leaned her back against it. She drew up her weary feet and tucked them under her skirt. My, did that feel good! She heaved a sigh of relief, snuggled up against the sack, and was asleep before she knew it. But she was haunted by the weirdest dreams. In one of them she saw old Beppo, with his broom held crossways like a balancing pole, teetering along a tightrope suspended above a dark chasm. "Where's the other end?" she heard him call over and over again. "I can't see the other end." And the tightrope did indeed seem infinitely long, so long that it stretched away into the darkness in both directions. Momo yearned to help the old man, but she couldn't even attract his attention. He was too high up and too far away. Then she saw Guido pulling a paper streamer out of his mouth. He pulled and pulled, but the streamer was endless and unbreakable. In fact, he was already standing on a big mound of paper. It seemed to Momo that he was gazing at her, imploringly, as if he would suffocate unless she came to his rescue. She tried to run to him, but her feet became entangled in the coils of paper, and the more she struggled to free herself, the more entangled she became. And then she saw the children. They were all as flat as playing cards, and each card had a pattern of little holes punched in it. Every time the cards were shuffled, they had to sort themselves out and be punched with a new pattern of holes. The card children were crying bitterly, but all Momo could hear was a sort of clattering sound as they were shuffled yet again and fluttered down on top of each other. "Stop!" she shouted, but her feeble voice was drowned by the clatter, which grew louder and louder until it finally woke her up. It was dark, and for a moment she couldn't think where she was. Then she remembered climbing aboard the delivery truck and realized that it was on the move. That was what had woken her, the sound of the engine. Momo wiped her cheeks, which were still wet with tears, and wondered where she could be. The truck had evidently been on the move for some time, because it was in a different part of the city. At this late hour, not a soul could be seen in the streets, not a light showed anywhere in the tall buildings that flanked them. The truck was going quite slowly, and Momo, without stopping to think, jumped out. She began walking in the opposite direction, eager to get back to the crowded streets that seemed to offer protection from the man in gray. Then, remembering her nightmares, she came to a halt. The sound of the engine gradually faded until silence enveloped the darkened street. She would stop running away, Momo decided. She had done so in the hope of saving herself. All this time she had been preoccupied with herself, her own loneliness and fear, when it was really her friends who were in trouble. If anyone could save them, she could. Remote as the chances of persuading the men in gray to release them might be, She must at least try. Once she reached this conclusion, she felt a mysterious change come over her. Her feelings of fear and helplessness had reached such a pitch that they were suddenly transformed into their opposites. Having overcome them, she felt courageous and self-confident enough to tackle any power on earth. More precisely, she had ceased to worry about herself. Now she wanted to meet the man in gray, wanted to at all costs. I must go to the amphitheater at once, she told herself. Perhaps it still isn't too late. Perhaps he'll be waiting for me. That, however, was easier said than done. She didn't know where she was and hadn't the least idea which direction to take, but she started walking anyway. On and on she walked through the dark, silent streets. Being barefoot, she couldn't even hear her own footsteps. Every time she turned a corner, she hoped to see something that would tell her she was on the right track, some landmark she recognized, but she never did. She couldn't ask the way either, because the only living creature she saw was a grimy, emaciated dog that was foraging for scraps in a rubbish heap and fled in panic at her approach. At last she came to a huge, deserted square. It wasn't a handsome square with trees or a fountain in the middle, but an empty, featureless expanse, fringed with buildings whose dark shapes stood outlined against the night sky. Momo set off across the square. When she reached the middle, a clock began to chime, not far away. It chimed a good many times, so perhaps it was already midnight. If the man in gray was waiting for her at the amphitheater, Momo reflected, she had no chance at all of getting there in time. He would go away without seeing her, and any chance of saving her friends would be gone, perhaps forever. She chewed her knuckles, wondering what to do. She had absolutely no idea. "Here I am," she called into the darkness, as loud as she could. She had no real hope that the man in gray would hear her, but she was wrong. Scarcely had the last chime died away when lights appeared in all the streets that led to the big empty square, faint at first, but steadily growing brighter, drawing nearer. And then Momo realized they were the headlights of innumerable cars, all converging on the spot where she stood. Dazzled by the glare, no matter which way she turned, she shielded her eyes with her hand. So they were coming after all. But Momo hadn't expected them to come in such strength. For a moment, all her newfound courage deserted her. Hemmed in and unable to escape, she shrank as far as she could in her baggy old jacket. Then, remembering the hour lilies and the mighty chorus of voices, she instantly felt comforted. The strength flowed back into her limbs. Meanwhile, with their engines purring softly, the cars had continued their slow advance. At last they stopped, bumper to bumper, in a circle whose central point was Momo herself. The men in gray got out. Momo couldn't see how many of them there were because they remained outside the ring of headlights, but she sensed that many eyes were on her, unfriendly eyes, and a shiver ran down her spine. No one spoke for a while, neither Momo nor any of the men in gray. Then a flat, expressionless voice broke the silence. "I see," it said. "So this is Momo, the girl who thought she could defy us. Just look at her now, the miserable creature." These words were followed by a dry, rattling sound that vaguely resembled a chorus of mocking laughter. "Careful," hissed another gray voice. "You know how dangerous she can be. It's no use trying to deceive her." Momo pricked up her ears at this. "Very well," said the first voice from the darkness beyond the headlights. "Let's try the truth for a change." Another long silence fell. Momo sensed that the men in gray were afraid to tell the truth, so afraid that it imposed a tremendous strain on them. She heard what sounded like a gasp of exertion from 1,000 throats. At long last, one of the disembodied voices began to speak. It came from a different direction, but it was just as flat and expressionless as the others. "All right, let's be blunt. You're all on your own, little girl. Your friends are out of reach, so you've no one to share your time with. We've planned it that way. You see how powerful we are. There's no point in trying to resist us. What do they amount to, all these lonely hours of yours? A curse and a burden, nothing more. You're completely cut off from the rest of mankind." Momo listened and said nothing. "Sooner or later," the voice droned on, "you won't be able to endure it any longer. Tomorrow, next week, next year, it's all the same to us. We shall simply bide our time, because we know that in due course you'll come crawling to us and say, 'I'll do anything, anything at all, as long as you relieve me of my burden.' But perhaps you've already reached that stage. You have only to say." Momo shook her head. "So you won't let us help you?" the voice pursued coldly. Momo felt an icy breeze envelop her from all sides at once, but she gritted her teeth and shook her head again. "She knows what time is," whispered another voice. "That proves she really was with a certain person," the first voice replied, also in a whisper. Aloud it asked, "Do you know Professor Hora?" Momo nodded. "You actually paid him a visit?" She nodded again. "So you know about the hour lilies?" She nodded a third time. Oh yes, how well she knew. There was another longish silence. When the voice began to speak again, it came from another direction. "You love your friends, don't you?" Another nod. "And you'd like to set them free?" Yet another nod. "You could, if you only would." Momo was shivering with cold in every limb. She drew the jacket more tightly around her. "It wouldn't take much to save them. You help us, and we'll help you. That's only fair, isn't it?" The voice was coming from yet another direction. Momo stared intently at its source. "The thing is, we'd like to make Professor Hora's acquaintance, but we don't know where he lives. All we want is for you to show us the way. That's right, Momo. Listen carefully, so you know we're being honest with you and mean what we say. In return, we'll give you back your friends and let you all lead the carefree, happy-go-lucky life you used to enjoy so much. If that isn't a worthwhile offer, what is?" Momo opened her mouth for the first time. It was quite an effort to speak at all. Her lips felt so numb. "What do you want with Professor Hora?" she asked. "I told you, we want to make his acquaintance," the voice said sharply, and the air grew even colder. "That's all you need to know." Momo said nothing, just waited. "I don't understand you," said the voice. "Think of yourself and your friends. Why worry about Professor Hora? He's old enough to look after himself. Besides, if he's sensible and cooperates nicely, we won't harm a hair of his head. If not, we have ways of making him." Momo's lips were blue with cold. "Making him do what?" she asked. The voice sounded suddenly shrill and strained. "We're tired of collecting people's time by the hour, minute, and second. We want all of it right away, and Hora's got to hand it over." Horrified, Momo stared into the darkness beyond the ring of headlights. "What about the people it belongs to?" she asked. "What will happen to them?" "People?" The voice rose to a scream and broke. "People have been obsolete for years. They've made the world a place where there's no room left for their own kind. We shall rule the world." By now the cold was so intense that Momo could barely move her lips, let alone speak. "Never fear, though, little Momo," the voice went on, abruptly becoming gentle and almost coaxing. "That naturally won't apply to you and your friends. You'll be the last and only people on Earth to play games and tell stories. As long as you stop meddling in our business, we'll leave you in peace. Is it a deal?" The voice fell silent. A moment later it took up the thread from a different quarter. "You know we've told you the truth. We'll keep our promise. You can rely on that. And now, take us to Professor Hora." Momo tried to speak, almost fainting with cold. Finally, after several attempts, she said, "Even if I could, I wouldn't." "What do you mean, if you could?" the voice said menacingly. "Of course you can. You paid him a visit, so you must know the way." "I'd never find it again," Momo whispered. "I've tried. Only Cassiopeia knows it." "Who's Cassiopeia?" "The professor's tortoise." "Where is it now?" Momo, barely conscious, murmured, She came back with me, but I lost her. As if from a long way off, a chorus of agitated voices came to her ears. Issue a general alert, she heard. We've got to find that tortoise. Check every tortoise you come across. That animal's got to be found at all costs. The voices died away. Silence fell. Momo slowly regained her senses. She was standing by herself in the middle of the square. Nothing was stirring but a chill gust of wind that seemed to issue from some great empty void, a wind as gray as ashes. Chapter 18. The Pursuit. Momo didn't know how much time had passed. The church clock chimed occasionally, but she scarcely heard it. Her frozen limbs took ages to thaw out. She felt numb and incapable of making decisions. How could she go home to the amphitheater and climb into bed now that there was no hope left for herself and her friends? How could she, when she knew that things would never come right again? She was worried about Cassiopeia, too. What if the men in gray found her? She began to reproach herself bitterly for having mentioned the tortoise at all, but she'd been too dazed to think straight. Anyway, she reflected, trying to console herself, Cassiopeia may have found her way back to Professor Hora long ago. Yes, I hope she isn't still looking for me. It would be better for both of us. At that moment, something nudged her bare foot. Momo gave a start and looked down. There was Cassiopeia, as large as life, and she could dimly see some words on the animal's shell. Here I am again, they said. Without a second thought, Momo grabbed the tortoise and stuffed it under her jacket. Then she straightened up and peered in all directions, fearful that some men in gray might still be lurking in the shadows, but all was quiet. Cassiopeia kicked and struggled fiercely in an effort to escape. Holding her tight, Momo peeped inside the jacket and whispered, Please keep still. Why all the fuss? Demanded Cassiopeia. You mustn't be seen, Momo hissed. The next words to appear on the tortoise's shell were, Aren't you glad? Of course, Momo said with a catch in her voice. Of course I am. You've no idea. And she kissed Cassiopeia on the nose several times in quick succession. Cassiopeia responded with two rather pink words. Steady on, they read. Momo smiled. Have you been looking for me all this time? Of course. But how did you happen to find me here and now? I knew I would, was the laconic reply. Had Cassiopeia spent all those weeks looking for her, although she knew she wouldn't find her? If so, she needn't really have bothered to look at all. This was yet another of Cassiopeia's little mysteries. They made Momo's head spin if she thought about them too hard. And besides, this was scarcely the moment to puzzle over such problems. Momo gave the tortoise a whispered account of what had happened since last they met. What should we do now? She concluded. Cassiopeia had been listening attentively. Go to Hora, she spelled out. Now? Momo exclaimed, aghast. But they're looking for you everywhere. This is the only place they don't happen to be. Wouldn't it be wiser to stay here? But all the tortoise's shell said was, We're going anyway. We'll run right into them, Momo protested. Won't meet a soul, was Cassiopeia's response. If Cassiopeia was sure, that settled it. Momo put her down. Then, remembering their first long, arduous trek, she suddenly felt too exhausted to repeat it all over again. You go on alone, Cassiopeia, she said wearily. I am too tired. Go on alone, and give the professor my love. Cassiopeia's shell lit up again. It's not far. Momo was astonished to read that. It dawned on her as she looked around that this shabby and desolate-looking neighborhood might be the one that led to the district with the white houses and the strange shadows. If so, she might, after all, be able to make it as far as Never Lane and Nowhere House. All right, she said. I'll come too, but wouldn't it be quicker if I carried you? Afraid not, Cassiopeia replied. Why should you insist on crawling there by yourself? Momo said. but all she got was the enigmatic reply, "The way's inside me." On that note, the tortoise set off with Momo, following slowly, step by step. They had only just disappeared down a side street when the shadows around the square came to life, and the air was filled with a brittle sound like the snapping of dry twigs. The men in gray were chuckling triumphantly. Some of their number, who had stayed behind to keep a surreptitious watch on Momo, had witnessed her reunion with Cassiopeia. The wait had been a long one, but not even they had dreamed that it would yield such results. "There they go," whispered one gray voice. "Shall we nab them?" "Of course not," hissed another. "Let them carry on." "Why?" demanded the first voice. "Our orders were to capture the tortoise at all costs." "Yes, but why do we want it?" "So it can lead us to Hora." "Precisely. That's just what it's doing now. We won't even have to use force. It's showing us the way of its own free will, unintentionally." Another dry chuckle went up from the shadows around the square. "Pass the word at once. Call off the search and instruct all agents to join us here. Tell them to exercise the utmost care, though. None of us must be seen by our two unsuspecting guides, or get in their way. They're to be given free passage wherever they go. And now, gentlemen, let's follow at our leisure." It was hardly surprising, under these circumstances, that Momo and Cassiopeia failed to encounter a single one of their pursuers. Whichever way they went, the men in gray melted away in good time and joined the rear of the ever-growing procession that was silently, cautiously, following in the fugitives' wake. Momo was wearier than she had ever been in her life. There were times when she thought she would simply sink to the ground and fall asleep at any moment, but she forced herself to put one foot before the other. And for a while things went better. If only Cassiopeia wouldn't crawl along at such a snail's pace, she thought, but it couldn't be helped. She trudged along, looking neither right nor left, only at her feet and the tortoise. After an eternity, or so it seemed to Momo, the surface of the street grew suddenly paler. She wrenched her leaden eyelids open and looked around. Yes, they had finally reached the district where the light was neither that of dawn nor dusk, and where all the shadows ran in different directions. There were the forbidding white houses with the cavernous black windows, and there was the peculiar egg-like monument on its black stone plinth. At the thought that it wouldn't be long before she saw Professor Hora again, Momo's courage revived. "Please," she said to Cassiopeia, "couldn't we go a bit faster?" "More haste, less speed," came the reply, and the tortoise crawled on even more slowly than before. Yet Momo noticed, as she had the first time, that they made better progress that way. It was as if the street beneath them glided past more quickly the slower they went. That, of course, was the secret of the district with the snow-white houses. The slower you went, the better progress you made, and the more you hurried, the slower your rate of advance. The men in gray hadn't known that when they pursued Momo in their cars, which was how she had escaped them. But that was the last time. Things were quite different now that they had no intention of overtaking the girl and the tortoise. Now, because they were trailing them at exactly the same speed, they had discovered the secret. Gradually, the streets behind Momo and Cassiopeia became filled with an army of men in gray. And as the pursuers grew accustomed to the peculiarities of the district, they went even slower than their quarry, with the result that they steadily overhauled them. It was like a race in reverse, a go-slow race. On and on the strange procession went, further and further into the dazzling white glow, weaving back and forth through the dream streets until it came to the corner of Never Lane. Cassiopeia turned into the lane and crawled toward Nowhere House. Momo, remembering that she'd failed to make any headway until she had turned around and walked backwards, did the same again. And that was when her heart stood still. The time thieves, like a gray wall on the move, stretched away for as far as the eye could see, rank upon rank of them filling the entire width of the street. Momo cried out in terror, but she couldn't hear her own voice. She walked backwards down Never Lane, staring wide-eyed at the advancing host of men in gray. But then another strange thing happened. As soon as the leaders tried to enter the lane, they vanished before her very eyes. Their outstretched hands were the first to disappear, then their legs and bodies, and last of all their faces, which wore a look of surprise and horror. But Momo wasn't the only one to have witnessed this phenomenon. It also had been seen by the men in gray who were following behind. They shrank back, bracing themselves to resist the pressure of those still advancing in the rear, and something of a scuffle ensued. Momo saw her pursuers scowl and shake their fists, but they dared not pursue her any further. At last she reached Nowhere House. The big bronze door swung open. She darted inside, raced down the corridor lined with statues, opened the tiny door at the other end, ducked through it, ran across the great hall to the little room enclosed by grandfather clocks, threw herself down on the dainty little sofa, and, not wanting to see or hear anything more, buried her head under a cushion.